The blood hit the snow before she heard the shot. She didn't stop, didn't look back, pressed her knee into her horse's flank and drove hard for the tree line 20 yards away, the only cover between her and three men who rode like they were collecting something they were already owed. She made the trees. They didn't follow. That told her everything about whose territory this was. He stepped out from between the pines like he'd been there since the mountain was young, tall, hard-faced. A rifle held across his body the way a man holds something he doesn't need to raise. He looked at the blood soaking through her coat, then at the men waiting at the tree line, then back at her. "You should have kept riding," he said. She looked south, toward the wagon, toward the girl inside it who hadn't stopped crying in 2 days. She knew he was right. She rode back anyway. Before we go further, subscribe if you haven't. Drop a like if you're already in. There's a canyon ahead and not everyone rides out of it. He should have let her go. That was the sensible thing, the survivable thing. A wounded woman riding toward armed men was a problem she'd made for herself. And Cole Bridger had learned a long time ago that other people's problems had a way of becoming graves if you stood too close to them. He followed anyway, stayed high on the ridge, moving parallel through the pine shadow, close enough to see but far enough that his breath wouldn't betray him in the cold air. She rode with her hands still pressed against her ribs, back straight, chin level, the kind of posture that costs something to maintain when your body is arguing against it. She found the wagon in the draw below the second switchback. 2 men, a cook fire that hadn't been burning long. A canvas-covered wagon pulled off the trail at an angle that wasn't accidental, positioned to be seen from one direction and hidden from every other. Cole went still. He'd seen that configuration before. The Apache woman pulled up 20 feet short of the fire and spoke first. Cole couldn't hear the words from the ridge, but he read the shape of the conversation easily enough. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, the way you move when you're trying to appear smaller than you are. One of the men laughed. The other didn't, which made him the more dangerous of the two. Then she gestured toward her horse. Cole's jaw tightened. She was offering the animal, trading it, for whatever was in that wagon. The man who hadn't laughed walked to the back of the wagon and pulled the canvas aside just far enough, just long enough for Cole to see. A girl, small, 11, maybe 12. Wrists bound in front of her with leather cord, sitting upright against the wagon wall with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that stillness is safer than movement. Her eyes were open but focused on nothing. Cheyenne, by the cut of her dress. What was left of it? Cole's hand moved to his rifle without him deciding to move it. The negotiation below was going wrong. He could see it in the way the laughing man had stopped laughing, in the way he'd taken 2 steps to his left, positioning himself between the Apache woman and her horse, cutting off the exit without appearing to. That's when Cole saw the third man, high on the opposite ridge, moving slow and deliberate along the rock shelf, angling for a sightline on the woman's back. Not one of the negotiators, a closer, someone whose job began after the talking stopped. These weren't opportunists. Opportunists didn't post Overwatch on a canyon ridge. Opportunists didn't have pre-positioned wagons and 3-man teams running coordinated approaches on isolated travelers. This was a route, practiced, repeated. The kind of operation that didn't exist without a network behind it and a market waiting at the other end. The girl in the wagon wasn't the beginning of something. She was the middle of it. Cole pulled back from the ridge edge, exhaled slow, and made the only calculation that mattered now. There were 3 of them. There was one of him. And the woman below had just run out of time to finish her negotiation. The shot was there, clean, certain, and available, the way good shots rarely are and bad situations almost never offer. The man on the ridge had stopped moving, settled into a crouch behind a flat shelf of granite, and was lining his sightline on the Apache woman's back with the practiced patience of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. Cole had him at 200 yards, downwind. The light was right. The angle was right. One trigger pull and the third man was no longer a problem, and in the confusion that followed, the Apache woman might find enough space to run. Might. Cole held the shot. Below, the negotiation had stopped pretending to be a negotiation. The laughing man had moved again, another step left, then a slow quarter turn that put his body between the woman and open ground. Casual, conversational, the kind of movement that looks like nothing until you understand what it's building toward. The second man stood at the wagon's rear corner with his thumb hooked in his belt, watching. The girl hadn't moved. Cole exhaled, sighted, held. His cabin was 3 miles north. The fire he'd banked that morning would still be breathing, low and steady, enough heat in the stones to warm the room through until nightfall if he got back before the wind shifted. He had venison hung in the cold shed, a full cord of split pine stacked along the east wall. Everything a man needed to get through a mountain winter without involving himself in other people's disasters. He'd built that life deliberately, piece by piece, over 7 years of deliberate removal from the kind of situations that were unfolding in the draw below him right now. He knew exactly what this was. He knew exactly how it ended for people who stepped into it without position, without backup, without anything except the conviction that stepping away was worse. He raised the rifle. The man on the ridge shifted slightly, resettling his weight. Cole tracked the movement, adjusted, held the sight picture steady. Below, the laughing man said something that made the Apache woman go very still. Cole lowered the rifle, raised it again. The man on the ridge had a job, same as the two below. He was probably somebody's brother, probably somebody's son. He was also about to put a bullet in the back of a wounded woman who had ridden into this draw alone because there was a child in that wagon and no one else was coming. Cole thought about that. He thought about the girl's eyes, open and focused on nothing. The way eyes look when a person has decided that the inside of their own head is safer than the outside world. He thought about the route, the configuration, the practiced, coordinated patience of men who did this regularly and had never been interrupted. He lowered the rifle for the last time, stood up, and walked out of the tree line, not running, not low, not angled for cover or advantage, because there was no cover and there was no advantage, and any man watching from the ridge would see through a tactical approach before he got 10 yards into the open. So he walked straight, rifle held across his body at a carry, not raised, not slung, visible, but not yet committed. The way you hold something when you want people to understand you've thought about what comes next and aren't afraid of it. He walked toward the wagon like a man arriving at a place he meant to be. The laughing man saw him first. The laughter, whatever remained of it, left his face completely. "That's far enough," he said. His hand moved to his hip but stopped short of drawing, reading Cole the way men read things they've heard about but never seen up close. Cole didn't stop. He walked to within 20 feet of the fire and stood there, letting himself be looked at, letting the calculation happen. He was a large man and age had taken nothing structural from him, only softened the edges of the threat he projected, made it quieter, which in Cole's experience made it worse. "Cole Bridger," the second man said. Not a question. His voice had the particular flatness of someone who just done arithmetic and didn't like the sum. "You know my name," Cole said. "Then you know I don't have a reason to be patient." A beat of silence. "What's your interest here?" the laughing man asked. Cole looked at the wagon, at the girl visible through the gap in the canvas, then back. "Same as hers," he said. The Apache woman hadn't moved during any of this. She sat her horse with her hand still pressed against her ribs and her eyes tracking the ridge above, which meant she already knew about the third man, had probably known since before she reached the fire, and had ridden in any way with full understanding of the geometry. Cole filed that away. The laughing man looked at his partner. Something passed between them, not a decision, but the beginning of one. Then the second man pulled his weapon. Then the man on the ridge came down. And Cole Bridger, who had walked into this draw with one rifle, no cover, and no advantage except the belief that some things are wrong enough to walk toward, found himself at gunpoint in a canyon he didn't know well enough, with a wounded woman beside him and a Cheyenne girl in a wagon watching through a gap in the canvas with eyes that had just, for the first time in what looked like days, focused on something outside her own head. She was looking at him. He gave her a single, small nod. Then he put his hands up slowly, deliberately, and let them take his rifle. They moved deeper into the canyon as the light failed. Cole had expected resistance when they took his rifle, a search, restraints, something that communicated panic or urgency. What he got instead was efficiency. The laughing man slung Cole's rifle across his own back, with the ease of a man adding one more item to a familiar load. The man from the ridge fell in behind them without a word. The second man climbed onto the wagon box and released the brake, and the whole operation resumed moving as though the interruption had been minor and the destination had always been somewhere deeper in. That bothered Cole more than the gun at his back. Panicked men make noise. Panicked men argue, over-explain, check and recheck. These men were quiet and coordinated and entirely unsurprised by the presence of a mountain man and a wounded Apache woman in their custody, which meant this had happened before, which meant there was a place at the end of this canyon that was designed to receive what they were bringing. Cole walked and counted. The canyon walls rose and narrowed as they moved south, the trail threading between rock formations that blocked sightlines in every direction, no view of the ridge above, no view of what was ahead until you were already inside it. Good design. Natural but improved. He noticed the trail had been cleared of loose rock in stretches, the kind of work that takes time and intention. Someone had maintained this approach. They came around a long bend in the canyon wall, and Cole stopped counting steps and started counting fires. 7. Spread across a wide flat shelf of canyon floor that opened without warning from the narrow passage, a natural amphitheater of stone, sheltered on 3 sides, accessible only through the approach they'd just taken or a high switchback trail cut into the east wall. Fires placed deliberately for warmth and visibility within the camp, but invisible from any ridge above. Cole had ridden this territory for the better part of a decade and had never known this shelf existed. He counted men next. 11 visible, more likely in the tents, 4 of them canvas, military surplus by the cut. A rope line for horses along the north wall, a dozen animals at least. Supply crates stacked under an overhang. And along the south wall, where the rock curved inward and the firelight didn't reach well. Cages, not cells, not a structure. Actual wooden barred cages, the kind built for transport low enough that a person inside couldn't stand upright. 3 of them, 2 occupied. Cole kept his face still. The Apache woman rode beside him, her horse moving slow, her breathing controlled. She hadn't spoken since they left the draw. Hadn't looked at him, hadn't looked at the men around them, had kept her eyes moving across the camp in the same systematic way Cole was using, counting, mapping, calculating. She'd been doing it longer. She knew more than he did about what this was. A man came out of the largest tent. He wasn't what Cole expected. He was 60, maybe a few years past it, with a trimmed gray beard and a wool coat that had been expensive once and still carried itself accordingly. He wore no weapon that Cole could see, which in this context meant he didn't need one. He walked toward them with the unhurried authority of a man arriving at a meeting he called himself, and he looked at Cole with an expression that wasn't surprise and wasn't quite satisfaction, something between recognition and amusement, the way a man looks at something he'd predicted and is now watching arrive on schedule. "Mr. Bridger," he said, "I'd hoped the ridge would turn you back." Cole didn't answer. The man's eyes moved to the Apache woman, cooled slightly, then returned to Cole. "Put them by the east fire," he said to the men behind them. "Feed them if they'll eat. Mr. Bridger's rifle goes in my tent." He turned and walked back the way he'd come, and the camp absorbed them without ceremony. They sat them by the fire as instructed, no restraints, which was its own kind of statement. Restraints implied a prisoner who might run. No restraints implied a man confident enough in his position that running wasn't a meaningful option. Cole looked at the canyon walls, looked at the switchback trail on the east side which had 2 men on it, looked at the approach passage which had been closed behind them by the man from the ridge and one other. He looked at the cages, 2 people inside. One adult, one child, difficult to see clearly from this distance, but the adult was sitting up and the smaller figure was lying down with their back to the firelight. Cole looked at the wagon. The Cheyenne girl had been moved inside the largest tent. He couldn't see her anymore. He put his forearms on his knees and stared into the fire and did the arithmetic slowly and honestly. The way you do arithmetic when the numbers aren't on your side and sentiment isn't going to change them. 11 visible men, likely 15 total. 1 entrance effectively controlled. His rifle gone. The Apache woman wounded. 2 additional captives he hadn't planned for. And a man in a wool coat who knew his name and hadn't bothered to explain how. The Apache woman's voice came low, and even without preamble, without turning her head toward him. "I told you I couldn't keep riding." Cole watched the fire. "You knew this was here," he said, "not an accusation, a calibration. I knew something was here, I didn't know how much of it." A pause. "I knew about the girl, my sister's daughter, taken 6 days ago from a camp 2 ridges north of the pass." Another pause, shorter. "I knew about the route, I didn't know the end of it." "Now you do." "Now we do," she said. Cole looked at the tent where the girl had been taken, looked at the cages, looked at the man who had come out to greet them like a host at a dinner he'd prepared in advance. "You rode into a 3-man ambush on a canyon trail," he said, "with a bullet already in you, knowing there was something at the end of it bigger than you could handle alone." She said nothing. "That's not courage," Cole said. "That's something else." She turned and looked at him then directly, for the first time since the tree line, and her expression was the particular expression of someone who has heard a variation of that sentence before and stopped being wounded by it. "She's 11 years old," she said, "and she has been in that wagon for 6 days." She turned back to the fire. "What would you have me do differently?" It wasn't a question. Cole sat with it for a long moment, the fire settling between them, the camp moving and breathing around them in the dark. Then, quietly, with the particular flatness of a man revising an opinion he'd held too long and too loosely. "Nothing," he said. "I wouldn't have you do a single thing differently." He looked at the tent again, at the cages, at the man in the wool coat moving behind the canvas, casting a shadow that stretched long and deliberate across the firelit ground. Cole had walked into this draw because something was wrong and walking away was worse. He understood now that he hadn't known when he made that choice how much worse it actually was, how deep the wrong went, how long it had been running. He understood it now. And the arithmetic, bad as it was, had just become the only arithmetic that mattered. The judge came to them after the camp had settled. Not immediately. He let them sit by the fire for the better part of an hour first, long enough for the cold to remind them of their situation, long enough for the arithmetic of the camp to fully register, long enough for the particular kind of psychological weight that comes from being inside something you can't see the edges of to settle across the shoulders like a second coat. Cole recognized the technique. He'd seen it used in different rooms by different men who understood that patience was a form of pressure when applied correctly. He sat with it and didn't let it move him. The Apache woman had said nothing more since their exchange at the fire. She'd torn a strip from the inside hem of her riding coat and repacked the wound at her ribs with the focused efficiency of someone managing a problem rather than suffering one. Cole had watched her do it without offering help she hadn't asked for, which seemed to be the correct instinct. She was breathing carefully, shallow at the top, controlled at the release, and her color was holding, which meant the bullet had done damage but not catastrophic damage. She would need proper attention before morning. That was a fact he filed under problems to solve in the order they presented themselves. The judge sat down across the fire from them without ceremony and without invitation, the way men sit when they've decided the space belongs to them regardless of who was in it first. He had a tin cup in one hand, coffee, by the smell of it, and he held it with both palms wrapped around it, comfortable, unhurried, a man settling in for a conversation he'd been looking forward to. He looked at Cole for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "You're harder to look at than I expected." "That's been said before," Cole answered. "I mean it as an observation, not a complaint." He sipped the coffee. "I've known your name for several years, Mr. Bridger, known your history longer than that. A man of your particular reputation tends to accumulate a file, whether he intends to or not. I'm not interested in my reputation." "No, I don't imagine you are." The judge looked into his cup. "That's part of what makes you interesting." He paused. "The other part is the 7 years." Cole said nothing. The fire moved between them, throwing light and shadow in alternating measure across the judge's face, which was, Cole noted, a face that had learned to present nothing it didn't intend to present. Controlled in the way that certain faces become controlled after decades of being watched and read and argued against. A courtroom face. The kind that had rendered verdicts and accepted no appeal. "Harlan Creek," the judge said. "Late October 1871. Your wife, your son, your daughter." He said the last 3 words quietly, and with what sounded, on the surface, like respect. The kind of respect a man demonstrates when he wants you to believe he's capable of it. "You've blamed the Mescalero Band out of the Southern Valley for 7 years. You've carried that name like a stone in your chest. I know because I've watched men carry things like that, and I know what it does to the architecture of a person over time." Cole's hands were resting on his knees. He didn't move them. "You're going to offer me something," Cole said. "I'm going to offer you the truth," the judge said, "which is rarer and more valuable than anything else I could put in front of you." He set the cup down in the dirt beside him and folded his hands. "The Mescalero didn't kill your family, Mr. Bridger. They were blamed because blaming them was useful to certain people at a certain time, and because a grieving man in the mountains doesn't have access to the kind of information that would complicate the story he's been given." He paused. "I know the name of the man who gave the order. I know where he is. And I'm prepared to give you both pieces of that information, completely, accurately, and without condition. If you choose to walk out of this canyon tonight and continue the very sensible habit of not involving yourself in other people's business." The fire snapped. Somewhere in the camp behind them, a horse shifted against its line and went still. Cole sat with the words the way you sit with something hot, carefully, at a slight distance, giving it time to show you its true temperature before you decide how to handle it. 7 years. He had been carrying the weight of Harlan Creek for 7 years with the particular endurance of a man who has no outlet for grief except forward motion, and no language for loss except the hard, wordless vocabulary of survival. He had not spoken his wife's name aloud in 4 years. Not because he'd forgotten it, he would never forget it, but because speaking it in the wrong context felt like a desecration, and there had been no context that felt right. He had a boy's boot in a tin box on the shelf above his fireplace. One boot, the left one, because the right one had been lost and he'd kept the left one because keeping nothing felt like a surrender he wasn't prepared to make. 7 years of carrying the wrong name. 7 years of a grief aimed in the wrong direction, burning in the wrong channel, fueling a silent and private and utterly misdirected form of account keeping that had never resolved because it was never going to resolve, because the arithmetic was wrong from the beginning, because someone had handed him a false answer to a real wound, and he had accepted it because he was broken and alone, and it was all he had. The judge was watching him with the particular attention of a man who knows he's landed something and is waiting to feel the line go taut. Cole looked across the fire. The Apache woman was watching him, not with urgency, not with judgment, with the steady, patient attention of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and recognizes it when it arrives. Her dark eyes held the firelight without moving, and her expression was not readable in the conventional sense. It wasn't pity, it wasn't warning, it wasn't appeal. It was something quieter than all of those things, something that lived underneath expression rather than on top of it. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the judge, and he understood with the slow, certain clarity of a man who has lived long enough to recognize the architecture of a trap even when the bait is real, exactly what was being offered and exactly what it would cost. Not the walk out of the canyon, not the silence afterward, the pretending he hadn't seen the cages, hadn't counted the fires, hadn't watched a Cheyenne girl with vacant eyes sit in a transport wagon in the middle of a supply route that had been running long enough to have a maintenance schedule. The cost was simpler than that. The cost was becoming the kind of man who could be offered that trade and take it. He already knew what kind of man he was. He had known since he walked out of the tree line that afternoon with no cover and no advantage and no plan except that something was wrong and walking away was worse. He just had to decide if he was still that man. He was. No, Cole said. The judge didn't move. The name, Cole said, isn't worth what you're asking me to pay for it. A long silence settled between them, filled only by the fire and the distant sound of the camp at night, men moving, horses breathing, the creak of wood from the direction of the cages that Cole did not let himself look at because looking at it right now would not help anything and he needed to stay level. The judge picked up his coffee cup, looked into it, set it down again, and then quietly he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a cruel one either. It was the smile of a man who has run a long and complicated game and has just arrived at the part he'd been working toward from the beginning, the part where the board looks one way to everyone else and entirely different to him. I know, the judge said. I knew you'd say no. Cole watched him. I knew before I sat down, the judge continued. I knew when I saw you walk out of that tree line this afternoon, no rifle raised, no angle, no advantage, just walking straight at something because you decided it was wrong. He looked at Cole with something that in another man might have been called admiration, and in this man was something colder and more calculated than that. Men like you don't take trades like that. I've met enough of you to know the species. Then why offer it, Cole said. Because I needed to know how much you knew, the judge said simply. And a man's refusal tells you more about what he's carrying than his acceptance ever could. He stood up, smoothed the front of his coat, looked at the Apache woman, a long, assessing look that she returned without expression. Get some rest, he said. Both of you. We'll talk about what comes next in the morning. He walked back toward the large tent, and the canvas closed behind him, and the camp went on breathing around them in the dark as though nothing of consequence had just happened. Cole stared into the fire. He had refused the name. He had done it cleanly, without hesitation, without the dramatic internal performance that lesser moments sometimes demanded. He had simply looked at what was being offered, understood the price, and said no. But sitting now in the firelight with the weight of 7 years still in his chest, and the wrong name still in his memory like a splinter too deep to reach. He felt the cost of it. Not regret, not doubt, just the honest, unadorned weight of a principle held under pressure which never feels noble in the moment and never asks you to feel good about it. He sat with that weight, and he didn't put it down, and he didn't pretend it wasn't there. Across the fire, the Apache woman was very still, and watching him with an expression that had shifted, barely perceptibly, into something he couldn't yet name. Cole just made his choice. But the judge is still smiling, and that smile means something. If this story has you locked in, hit that like button now and subscribe if you haven't. Because what that smile means is coming in the next few minutes, and you won't see it coming. She spoke after the camp had gone quiet. Not immediately. She waited until the fire had burned down another quarter and the nearest men had settled into the particular stillness of people who are present but not attending, and then she spoke in a voice pitched precisely low enough to carry to Cole and no further. "He already knew you would refuse," she said. "I heard him," Cole said. "I mean he knew before tonight." She paused. "He's known for longer than you understand yet." Cole looked at her. Her eyes were on the fire, but the quality of her attention had changed. It was directed inward now, toward something she was organizing, something she had been carrying in a particular arrangement for a long time and was preparing to set down in a specific order. "My name is Njoni," she said. "My father was a trader. My mother was born in the canyon country east of the Mogollon Rim. I have been living 2 ridges north of the southern pass for the past 4 years. She paused. "Before that, I lived further east, near a creek valley the settlers called Harlan." The fire between them made no sound. Cole's hands were still on his knees. "In October of 1871, she said, "I was 13 years old. My father had a trading arrangement with 3 settler families in that valley. We camped at the eastern tree line during the trading season, close enough to be useful, far enough to be safe." She stopped, drew a slow breath that had something careful in it, the breath of someone approaching a room they have stood outside for a very long time. "I was in those trees the night it happened." The words arrived in Cole's chest like a stone dropped into still water, impact first, then the slow, radiating consequence of what had been disturbed. He didn't speak. "I saw the men who came," Njoni said. "I saw their faces. I saw their horses. 3 of them had a particular brand on the left shoulder, a mark I didn't know then but learned later." She paused. "I saw them ride away. And I saw the direction they came from and the direction they returned to, and it was not the Southern Valley, Mr. Bridger. It was not the Mescalero. It was not any band or any people from that territory." She turned and looked at him directly. "They were white men, 4 of them, riding horses with a contractor's brand, out of the Territorial Supply Office in Prescott." The camp breathed around them. Somewhere along the rope line, a horse shifted its weight and was still. Cole sat with what she had said the way you sit with something that rearranges the furniture of 7 years without asking permission, quietly, with a kind of internal stillness that isn't peace and isn't shock, but is the particular suspended state of a man watching a truth he has carried in the wrong shape finally assume its correct form. "You've known this for 7 years, he said. "I have known it for 7 years, she said, "and I have been trying to reach you for the last 3 of them." A pause, brief, controlled, but carrying something underneath it that was neither brief nor controlled. "You are not an easy man to find when you don't want to be found. Nobody told me anyone was looking. Nobody knew to tell you. The people I asked, the traders, the relay riders, the few settlers I trusted enough to approach, they knew your name and your territory and very little else. You move like a man who has made a deliberate practice of leaving no address." "I had reasons for that." "I know what your reasons were," she said quietly. Another silence. The fire between them had settled into coals now, throwing heat without much light, and the camp around them had gone to the particular quiet of men who have stopped performing wakefulness and descended into actual sleep or something close to it. Cole looked at her. "You were riding to find me," he said. "2 days ago. Through the pass." "Yes." "And they shot you." "Yes." Cole looked at the tent where the judge had disappeared, looked at it for a long time with an expression that was very still on the surface and moving considerably beneath it. "That wasn't random," he said. "No," Nijoni said. "It was not random." The shape of it assembled itself in Cole's mind with the slow, inevitable clarity of a thing that has always been true and is only now becoming visible. The way a landscape resolves out of morning fog, not because it has changed, but because the light has finally reached the right angle. She had been riding to find him, to tell him what she'd seen at Harlan Creek 7 years ago, to give him the true shape of a grief he'd been carrying in the wrong direction for most of a decade. And someone had known she was coming. Someone had known what she carried and what it would mean if it reached him. Someone who understood that a man like Cole Bridger, handed the true name of the people responsible for his family's death, would not build a quiet life and let the information settle, would not write a letter to a territorial office or file a complaint with a circuit court or pursue any of the slow, institutional channels that powerful men had spent considerable energy making slow and institutional precisely so that outcomes could be managed. Someone who understood that Cole Bridger with the correct information was a problem that couldn't be administered. So they had sent men to intercept her. And the men they'd sent ran a supply route through this canyon. And the supply route had a terminus. And the terminus had a man in a wool coat who had sat across a fire from Cole an hour ago and offered him a name and watched his refusal with the smile of a man who had been running this particular game long enough to know all the moves in advance. "The judge," Cole said. Nijoni looked at him. "He's the one," Cole said. It wasn't a question. It had stopped being a question somewhere in the previous sentence. "The brand on those horses," she said, "was a contractor's mark registered to a territorial supply company that dissolved in 1873. I traced the registration forward through 2 successor companies and a land trust." She paused. "The land trust's primary beneficiary is listed in the territorial records under a legal firm in Prescott. The firm's founding partner retired from the bench in 1870. A pause. "His name is Douglas Harfield." Cole said nothing for a long moment. "He was a judge," Cole said. "He was the judge," Nijoni said. "The territorial circuit judge for the Eastern District for 11 years. He signed land assessments, settlement grants, contract awards. He had the authority to direct territorial resources and the connections to ensure that when things went wrong in his district, the blame landed where he aimed it." She looked at the tent. "He built this operation from the infrastructure of legitimate authority. The roots, the contacts, the protection, all of it grown from the root system of a career spent deciding what was legal and what wasn't." "And my family," Cole said. Nijoni was quiet for a moment. "Your land," she said carefully, "sat on a water source that Harfield had been trying to acquire through legal channels for 2 years before Harlan Creek. Your wife refused the third offer personally. She wrote a letter, I found a copy in the land office records, that was direct enough to constitute a public record of her refusal and specific enough to close the legal avenue permanently." She paused. Harfield needed the legal avenue closed in a different direction. The Coles breathed between them. Cole looked at his hands on his knees, at the firelight moving across his knuckles, at the left hand, which had a scar across the base of the thumb from a piece of fencing wire in the winter of 1871, 2 weeks before October, a detail so small and so permanent, and so entirely from the life he'd had before that the sight of it could still, on certain mornings, stop him where he stood. He had spent 7 years carrying the wrong name. He had spent 7 years pointed in the wrong direction by a man who was currently sleeping 40 feet away in a canvas tent, having spent the better part of an hour sitting across a fire from him, drinking coffee, explaining how well he understood Cole's nature. The judge had known. He had known who Nijoni was and what she carried. He had known she was coming because he had sent men to stop her, and those men had brought her here instead, which was either a contingency he'd planned for or an improvisation he'd adapted to with the ease of a man who had been managing contingencies for a very long time. He had known Cole's name, had known his history, his reputation, his territory, had watched him walk out of that tree line and recognized immediately what kind of man was walking toward him, had sat with him at the fire and offered him a false trade, not because he expected Cole to take it as he'd admitted himself, but because he needed to understand how much Cole knew and how much of it came from intuition versus fact. And now he was sleeping, or pretending to. Cole looked at the tent for a long moment. Then he looked at Nijoni. "The girl," he said, "your niece." "Seta," Nijoni said, and the name arrived differently from everything else she'd said, less composed, more immediate, carrying the particular weight of a word that belongs to a person rather than a fact. "My sister's youngest. She was taken from our camp 6 days ago by men on the northern approach to the pass. I was away trading when it happened." A pause. "When I returned and understood what had occurred, I understood also that the route they would use ran through this canyon." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I also understood that reaching you, telling you what I knew about Harfield had become more urgent than I had calculated. Because a man like Harfield, who had sent men to intercept me once, would send them again. And the next time he might not need me brought in. He might simply need me stopped." Cole looked at the cages along the south wall. "Who else is he holding?" "I don't know all of them," Nijoni said. "The two in the cages, I believe one is a Navajo woman taken from the eastern approach 3 weeks ago. The other I couldn't see clearly." She paused. "There will be more. This is a staging point, not a destination. They move people in batches when the numbers are sufficient." Cole sat with the full weight of it. The full, unmanageable, clarifying weight of it. A man who had killed his family, stolen his grief, handed him a false direction, and then built an empire of smaller cruelties in the years since, right here, in this territory, in this canyon, 40 feet away behind a canvas wall. He thought about the tin box on the shelf above his fireplace. The single boot inside it. The left one, kept because keeping nothing felt like a surrender he wasn't prepared to make. He thought about what Nijoni had said, carefully and without drama, about his wife's letter, about the water source, about the third refused offer and the legal avenue closed in the wrong direction. He thought about 7 years of a grief aimed at the wrong people. He thought about the Mescalero band in the Southern Valley, who had lived for 7 years under the shadow of a blame they didn't earn, in a territory where that kind of shadow had consequences that didn't require a court to deliver. He looked at the tent. He looked at the cages. He looked at Nijoni, at the wound she'd packed herself, at the composure she'd maintained through 2 days of captivity and pain, and the particular terror of knowing her niece was in a wagon somewhere ahead of her, at the steadiness with which she had delivered, piece by piece, the information she'd been carrying toward him for 3 years across difficult country, with no guarantee he'd be found at the end of it. She had ridden into a 3-man ambush, wounded, alone, because there was a child in a wagon and the man who could do something about it was somewhere in these mountains, and she had things to tell him that were 7 years overdue. He had told her that wasn't courage. He had been wrong. The fire between them was nearly out now. Just coals and the occasional breath of orange light when the draft moved through the camp. Around them, the night had gone fully quiet, the kind of quiet that arrives in the deep hours when even the animals have stopped attending to the world, and everything waits for the slow return of light. Cole looked at the east wall. At the switchback trail with its two guards, who had been on post for hours and whose attention, at this point in the night, was almost certainly less acute than it had been at sundown. He looked at the approach passage, at the single man visible near its entrance, seated on a rock with his rifle across his thighs. He looked at the cages, at the tent. He did the arithmetic one more time, slowly, honestly, without sentiment and without despair, and found that it was still bad and that it had also, in the last hour, become the only arithmetic that mattered. He looked at Nijoni. "How's the wound?" he said. She met his eyes. "Manageable," she said. Cole nodded once. "Then we need to talk about the morning," he said. "Because the judge is going to wake up with a decision to make about what to do with us. And I'd prefer to have already made a decision about what to do with him before he gets there." Nijoni was quiet for a moment. Then, for the first time since he'd seen her in the trees above the draw, since she'd sat her horse with her hand against her wound and her back straight and her eyes already calculating, something shifted in her expression. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. She reached into her coat, withdrew a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases, and held it out to him. "I've been carrying this for 3 years," she said. "Land records, contractor registrations." The name of Harfield's legal firm and the names of 2 men who witnessed the riders leaving Harlan Creek the night of October 14th, 1871, who are still alive and have agreed to testify. She paused. "I told you I was riding to find you. I didn't come empty-handed." Cole looked at the paper, took it, held it in both hands in the faint light of the dying fire and felt the weight of it, not the paper's weight, which was nothing, but the weight of what it represented. 3 years of a woman moving carefully through difficult territory, building a case, gathering names, folding and refolding a piece of evidence against a powerful man, until the creases had gone soft, waiting for the moment she could place it in the hands of someone who would know what to do with it. He looked up at her. "You didn't know if I was the right man for this," he said. "No," she said. "I didn't know until this afternoon." "When?" She looked at him steadily. "When you walked out of the tree line," she said. They moved before first light. Not because the plan was ready, it wasn't, not entirely, but because the window between the deep night stillness and the camp's morning routine was the only window available, and Cole had learned a long time ago that an imperfect plan executed at the right moment was worth considerably more than a perfect plan executed too late. Nijoni had slept for 2 hours. Cole hadn't slept at all. He'd sat by the cooling fire and watched the camp and counted breathing, and tracked the slow deterioration of the night guard's attention, with the patience of a man who had spent 7 years alone in mountain country, and understood that time, applied correctly, was the most reliable tool available. By the 3rd hour, the guard at the approach passage had his chin on his chest. By the 4th, the 2 men on the switchback trail had consolidated to one position near the top, sharing warmth in a way that narrowed their combined sightline to roughly a third of what it had been at sundown. Cole woke Nijoni with a hand on her shoulder and 2 words. She was upright before he finished saying them. They moved along the south wall first, staying in the shadow beneath the canyon rock, away from the coals of the nearest fire, moving with the compressed, deliberate slowness of people who understand that speed is the enemy of silence. Cole counted the sleeping shapes around the fires as they passed, counted the ones in the tents, kept the arithmetic running continuously, the way you keep a hand on a rope in the dark, not because you're certain it will hold, but because letting go is worse. The cages were worse up close than they'd been from across the camp. Low, transportable, built with functional brutality, enough structure to contain, not enough to consider. The Navajo woman inside the first one was awake. Had been awake, Cole suspected, for most of the night. She looked at him through the bars with eyes that had moved past fear into something harder and more enduring than fear. And she said nothing. And Cole respected that silence the way you respect any form of survival that has cost something to achieve. He worked the lock with the pick Nijoni produced from somewhere inside her coat without explanation, and he filed away the fact of its existence alongside everything else he'd been filing about her since the tree line. And the lock gave on the second attempt with a sound that was too loud in the canyon quiet and not loud enough to matter. The second cage held a boy. 14, maybe 15. He Korea Apache by the cut of his clothing, which was torn and dirty, and had been worn for longer than intended. He came out of the cage in a controlled crouch and straightened slowly and looked at Cole with an assessment that was rapid and accurate and resulted in a small nod that Cole returned without ceremony. 4 freed. 1 still missing. Seta. Nijoni's hand found Cole's arm in the dark, once brief, directional, and he turned and followed her line of sight to the large tent, which was dark and still and occupied, as far as Cole could determine, by the judge and at least 2 other men whose sleeping shapes he'd tracked to that location before midnight. Cole looked at the tent for a long moment. He thought about what was inside it, not just the judge. His rifle, the judge had said, "In my tent," which meant it was there. Which meant entering the tent was both necessary and the most dangerous single action available in the current arithmetic 3 sleeping men. An enclosed space, the near certainty that any sound above a certain threshold would activate the entire camp simultaneously. He looked at Nijoni. She looked back. Then she turned to the Navajo woman and spoke in a low, rapid exchange that Cole couldn't follow. And the woman listened and nodded once and took the boy by the shoulder and moved them both toward the approach passage, and the sleeping guard, with a competence that suggested she had already, in the hours of her captivity, mapped this camp more thoroughly than most people map spaces they're free to move through. Cole moved to the tent. The canvas flap was tied from the inside with a simple loop. Privacy, not security. He worked it with 2 fingers through the gap at the edge, slow enough that the fabric didn't pull and the loop came free, and he held it free and stood absolutely still for 10 seconds and listened to the breathing inside. 3 rhythms, all deep, all regular. He went in. The interior was dark in the way that canvas enclosures are dark, not absolute, but directionless. The faint ambient light of pre-dawn distributing itself without logic through the walls so that shapes existed but edges didn't. Cole let his eyes adjust for 3 full breaths and then began moving them methodically across the space. 2 men along the left wall, sleeping on bedrolls. A camp table in the center with papers and a lantern, unlit. Supply boxes along the right wall. And there, between the table and the right wall, leaning against a supply box with deliberate placement, like something set down carefully by someone who understood its value. His rifle. Cole crossed the tent in 4 steps that were not quite soundless but were close enough, and he picked up the rifle with both hands and felt the weight of it settle into his grip with the particular familiarity of something that belongs to you, and he checked it by touch in the dark, action, load hammer, and found it exactly as he'd left it. He turned to go, and Douglas Harfield said, from the darkness to his left, "I wondered if you'd come for it tonight or wait until morning." Cole went still, not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of a man who has just had a calculation confirmed that he'd hoped was wrong. He turned slowly toward the voice. Harfield was not on a bedroll. He was sitting upright in a camp chair against the tent wall, fully dressed, with a revolver resting on his knee, not aimed, not holstered. Resting. The posture of a man who had been sitting there, awake and waiting, for some portion of the night. The 2 men along the left wall were still breathing in the deep rhythms of actual sleep. Harfield had not woken them. Cole looked at the revolver on the judge's knee, looked at his own rifle in his hands. looked at the two sleeping men and the canvas walls and the camp outside and the passage through which, if the Navajo woman had moved well, 4 people were currently attempting a quiet exit. "You knew," Cole said, low enough not to wake the sleepers. "I suspected," Harfield said, with the precise accuracy of a man who values the distinction. "You're not a man who waits when he has information and a narrow window. I've read enough about your history to know that." He paused. "I've been sitting here since the second hour." "And you didn't wake your men?" "No." The word arrived with a weight that required examination. Cole examined it. "Why?" he said. Harfield was quiet for a moment. In the faint pre-dawn diffusion of light through the canvas, his face was visible in general terms: the gray beard, the wool coat, the particular set of a face that has rendered many verdicts and is now sitting with the approach of one it can't control. "Because," he said slowly, "I have been a great many things in my life, Mr. Bridger. Some of them I would defend before any court you care to name, some of them I would not." He paused. "But I have never, in 53 years of conducting business in this territory, made the mistake of believing that what I built was permanent. Permanent things don't require the kind of maintenance I've been performing for the last decade." He looked at Cole with something that was neither apology nor appeal, just the flat, clear-eyed accounting of a man who has done the arithmetic on himself and arrived at an honest sum. "I knew this canyon would end. I did not know it would end tonight or that it would end with you, but I knew." Cole stood in the half-dark with his rifle in his hands and 7 years of correctly aimed grief burning in his chest and the singular, terrible clarity of a man who has his answer within reach and must decide, right now, in this canvas tent with 2 men sleeping 3 feet away, what to do with it. He could raise the rifle. One movement. Clean and final and completely, permanently unreversible. 7 years of a boy's boot in a tin box, and a name carried in the wrong direction, and a wife's letter about a water source and a third refused offer. All of it ending here in the dark, with a sound that would wake the camp and cost him everything that came after. The revenge would be real. It would also be the last thing he ever did, because the camp would wake and the exit would be lost, and Nijoni would be found and Seta would be found, and the Navajo woman and the boy would be found, and whatever happened after that would not be justice by any definition that outlasted this canyon. He thought about Nijoni saying, "I've been carrying this for 3 years." He thought about the paper in his coat pocket, the land records, the contractor registrations, the names of 2 living witnesses who had agreed to testify. He thought about the Mescalero band in the Southern Valley, carrying for 7 years a blame they didn't earn. He thought about what justice meant when it died in a canyon with no witness and no consequence, when it was absorbed into the dark and the rock and left no mark on anything that continued. He lowered the rifle. Harfield watched him do it. "Stand up," Cole said. The judge looked at the revolver on his knee. "Leave it," Cole said. A long moment passed between them, long enough for Cole to feel the full weight of what he was choosing, and to choose it anyway, clearly, without drama, the way you make the decisions that cost the most. Harfield set the revolver on the arm of the camp chair and stood up. "You're going to walk out of this tent," Cole said, quietly. "You're going to walk through this camp and out the passage and up this canyon, and you're going to keep walking until I tell you to stop. If you make a sound that wakes anyone, I will make a different decision than the one I've just made. Do you understand me?" Harfield looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man taking the measure of a statement and finding it accurate. "Yes," he said. "Then move," Cole said. And Douglas Harfield, former territorial circuit judge, architect of a decade of coordinated cruelty, the man who had aimed Cole's grief in the wrong direction for 7 years and slept comfortably in its shadow, walked out of his own tent, through his own camp, past his own sleeping men, and into the gray pre-dawn of the canyon passage. With Cole Bridger 3 steps behind him, rifle raised, pointed at the future. The walk out of the canyon took 40 minutes. It felt longer. They came through the passage single file, Cole and Harfield first, then Nijoni with Seta close against her side, then the Navajo woman and the boy moving with the careful, ground-reading efficiency of people accustomed to traveling in conditions that don't accommodate mistakes. Nobody spoke. The canyon walls held the last of the night's cold in a way that pressed against the skin and sharpened the attention, and Cole kept his eyes on Harfield's back and his ears on the camp behind them, and counted his own heartbeats the way he counted everything, methodically, without sentiment, as a way of keeping the present moment primary. The camp didn't wake. Cole didn't know if that was fortune or something else, whether Harfield had, in his own complicated accounting, made a decision in that tent that extended beyond simply standing up. He didn't ask. There were things that didn't require examination when the examination would only complicate the forward movement, and this was one of them. They cleared the passage as the sky above the canyon walls began its slow shift from black to the particular deep blue that precedes dawn by half an hour. Cole oriented north by the rock formations he'd been reading since the previous afternoon, found the ridgeline he wanted, and moved them toward it without stopping. Nijoni fell into step beside him after the first mile, Seta on her other side, the girl's hand inside her aunt's with the grip of someone who has learned not to let go of what's safe. Cole glanced at the girl once, at her face, which was hollow with exhaustion but present in a way it hadn't been in the wagon, the vacancy replaced by something that was still fragile but was at least oriented toward the world outside her own head. She caught him looking. He looked away. They made the Granite Shelf Creek crossing by full dawn, and Cole called a stop there, water, rest, the assessment of wounds and conditions. The Navajo woman's name was Ayasha. The boy's name was Tarak. They accepted water and dried meat from Nijoni's pack without ceremony, and sat apart from Harfield with the particular spatial arrangement of people maintaining a necessary distance from something they have not yet processed. Harfield sat on a rock above the creek and said nothing. He had said nothing since the canyon. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, and wore the expression of a man doing his own accounting in the long, private way that public men sometimes do when the public performance is finally over, and there is nothing left to manage. Cole watched him from across the creek and felt not pity, and not satisfaction, a kind of grim, clear-eyed acknowledgement that the man on the rock was still a man, with whatever that contained. It didn't reduce what Harfield had done. It didn't alter the trajectory of what came next. It was simply true, and Cole had reached a point in his life where he didn't need things to be simple in order to act correctly. He crossed the creek, stood in front of Harfield. "The two men who will testify," Cole said, "are they safe?" Harfield looked up at him. Something moved through his eyes, surprise, possibly, that this was the first question. Then he said, "As far as I know, I haven't moved against them because I wasn't certain the woman had found them." "She found them," Cole said. Harfield nodded once. "The operation in the canyon," Cole said. "How many people know the full structure of it, not the workers, the architects?" "3," Harfield said. "Myself and 2 men in Prescott. One is a land commissioner. One is a federal contractor." He paused. "They will deny everything, and they have the resources to make denial effective if I'm not present to provide specifics." "Then you're going to provide specifics," Cole said. Harfield looked at him. "To who?" he said. "To the territorial marshal in Kingman," Cole said. "On paper, in your own hand, with enough detail that the denial becomes impossible." He paused. "You told me last night that you've known this canyon would end. This is how it ends, not in the dark with no witness. In a marshal's office, in daylight, on the record, in a way that reaches the men in Prescott and the roots beyond this territory, and whatever else this connects to that I don't know about yet." Harfield was quiet for a long moment. "You could have killed me in that tent," he said. "Yes," Cole said. "Why didn't you?" Cole looked at him steadily. "Because my wife deserves better than a verdict that no one hears," he said, "and so do the people in those cages." He left Harfield sitting on the rock and went back across the creek. The 3 days to Kingman were hard travel and harder weather. A late-season storm came down from the north on the second day, pushing temperatures below what was reasonable for the time of year, and turning the trail to a gray, half-frozen mixture that pulled at the horses' feet and required constant attention to navigate. Cole rode point. Harfield rode in the middle, wrists bound with rope, not tight enough to damage, tight enough to communicate. Nijoni rode beside him, which was her choice and which Cole suspected was partly practical and partly something else. The particular vigilance of a woman who had tracked this man across years of careful work, and was not prepared to take her eyes off him until he was in a room she couldn't follow him out of. Seda rode with her aunt for the first day and then, by the second morning, had moved her horse to within a length of Cole's without announcement or explanation. She didn't speak to him. He didn't speak to her. They rode in the particular companionable silence of people who have been through the same thing and understand that the thing doesn't require narration. On the afternoon of the second day, during a stop to rest the horses, she came and stood beside him while he checked the front shoe on his mare and said, without preamble, in English that was careful and precisely formed, "You came back for me." Cole straightened up, looked at her. "Your aunt came back for you," he said. "I came back because she did." Seda considered this with the serious, evaluating attention of a child who has recently learned that the world is more complicated than she was told and is adjusting her frameworks accordingly. "That's still coming back," she said. Cole had no answer for that. She went back to her horse. He stood for a moment with his hand on his mare's neck and something moving in his chest that he didn't try to name or manage. Just acknowledged, the way you acknowledge weather, as a condition of the current moment that will pass or won't, and either way requires you to keep moving. They reached Kingman on the afternoon of the third day. The territorial marshal's name was Greaves. He was a compact, deliberate man in his late 50s, with the particular demeanor of someone who has seen most of what the territory has to offer and has arrived, through long exposure, at a state of professional imperturbability that was not indifference. Cole could see the difference, and it was not indifference, but was the hard-won equilibrium of a man who understands that reacting emotionally to information delays the processing of it. He listened to Cole for 20 minutes without interruption. He looked at the paper Nijoni placed on his desk, the land records, the contractor registrations, the witness names, and read it with the focused attention of a man reading something he intends to act on. Then he looked at Harfield, who was sitting in a chair against the wall with his wrists still bound and his wool coat dusty from 3 days of hard travel, and he said, "You'll write it all down?" Harfield said yes. Greaves looked at Cole. "The camp in the canyon," he said. "The men there will have cleared it by now." "Most of them," Cole said. "The structure is still there. The evidence is still there. And the route doesn't disappear because one terminus clears. You'll find the connections in what he writes." Greaves nodded once, stood up, called for his deputy. Cole waited in the marshal's office while Harfield was taken to a back room with paper and a pen, and he sat in the chair across from the empty desk and looked at his hands and felt the particular exhaustion that arrives after a thing is done. Not the physical exhaustion of the travel, though that was present, but the deeper tiredness that comes from carrying something at full tension for an extended period, and finally being able to set it down. He hadn't set it down yet, but he could feel the possibility of it, which was more than he'd been able to feel for a long time. Nijoni found him outside an hour later. He was standing at the edge of the marshal's yard, looking north along the road that ran out of Kingman toward the high country, toward the particular band of ridgeline visible above the town's rooftops that he knew, by shape and orientation, was the beginning of the territory he'd spent 7 years moving through alone. She stood beside him without preamble, and they were both quiet for a moment. The way people are quiet when they've said most of what needs saying and are now in the territory that comes after words. Then she said, "Your wife's name." Cole looked at her. "Her name was Margaret," she said. "Your son was called James. Your daughter was called Ruth." She paused. "Your son was 7 years old and your daughter was 4. Your wife was 31. Another pause, shorter. "I know their names because my father recorded them in his trading log, the way he recorded everyone he did business with. He said Margaret Bridger drove a harder bargain than any man in the valley and laughed about it afterward." She paused once more, and her voice, which had remained steady through all of it, found a different quality in the next sentence, not broken, but honest in a way that went below the composure. "She was kind to me. The last time I saw her, she gave me a piece of cornbread from her kitchen and told me I had my father's eyes." Cole stood very still. The road ran north under a sky that had cleared after the storm, the kind of clear that only arrives after weather has moved through and taken everything loose with it, hard blue, deep, with a quality of light that made distances look shorter than they were. "She would have liked knowing you came," he said. His voice was level. "Barely. She would have come herself," Nijoni said, "if the positions had been reversed." Cole thought about that. He thought it was probably true. "The Mescalero," he said, "in the southern valley." "I know," Nijoni said. "That's a different conversation, a longer one." She paused. "But it's a conversation that can happen now, because of what Harfield will write in that room." She looked at him. "You gave that conversation the possibility of happening by walking him out of that canyon alive." Cole nodded slowly. He hadn't thought of it in those terms exactly. He'd thought of it in terms of what justice meant, and what outlasted the moment, and what his wife deserved from the resolution of her own story. But the Mescalero connection was real, and it was one more thing that revenge in a dark tent would have foreclosed permanently. And standing here on the far side of it, he could see the shape of the choice he'd made more clearly than he'd been able to see it in the moment. The choices that cost the most, in Cole's experience, always looked different from the far side. Smaller sometimes, more ordinary. Less like the dramatic moral architecture they felt like in the making, and more like simply the thing that had to be done by the person who was there to do it. He had been there. He had done it. That was all. They stood together for a while longer without speaking, the road running north between them and the high country, the light moving across the ridgeline in the slow way that late afternoon light moves when the season is turning, and the days are getting their hours back one slow minute at a time. Then Nijoni said, "I need to take Seta home." "I know," Cole said. "Ayesha and Tarek Greaves will see them to their families. He's that kind of man." "I know," Cole said again. She was quiet for a moment. "Then the trading log, my father's. It has the full record of the Harlan Creek family's names, transactions, dates, descriptions. It's been in my possession since he died." She paused. "I'll send it to the marshal's office, for the record." Cole looked at her. "Margaret's name should be in the official record," she said simply. "James, Ruth." She paused. "They should be in the record as people, not just as a land parcel in a contract dispute." Cole's jaw tightened once, then released. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in a way that the two words were not built to carry, and that she understood anyway, which was its own form of grace. She left him standing at the edge of the yard and went to find Seta. He watched her ride out 20 minutes later. North up the Kingman Road, Seta's horse close beside hers, the girl riding straight now, differently than she'd sat in the wagon, with the posture of someone returning to something rather than being taken from it. Nijoni rode without looking back. Cole stood at the edge of the marshal's property with his hands at his sides and watched them until the road bent north and the ridgeline took them and they were gone. He stood there for a while after, not because there was anything left to see, just because the standing felt necessary, a last beat of attention paid to something that deserved it, a closing of a particular account that had been open for 7 years and was now, not settled exactly, but moved into a different kind of ledger, one with more names in it, one that pointed in the correct direction. Margaret, James, Ruth. He said them quietly once to the empty road, not as grief exactly, not anymore, as something closer to return, as the acknowledgement that they had existed and had been known and had been worth 7 years of a man's hardest effort and would continue to be worth whatever came after, not as a wound, not as a direction for anger, but as the truest part of a life that was still, against considerable odds, continuing. Behind him, the marshal's office held a man writing a confession that would reach Prescott and beyond. Ahead of him, the road ran north toward the high country, and a cabin with a fire that had been cold for 4 days now, and a tin box on a shelf above the fireplace with a single boot inside it. He'd kept it because keeping nothing felt like a surrender he wasn't prepared to make. He still wasn't prepared to make it. But he thought, for the first time, that he might someday be ready to set the box down somewhere, not to forget it, not to lose it, but to put it in a place where it didn't have to be the first thing he saw every morning and the last thing he considered every night. To let it be part of the room rather than the point of the room. Maybe. He'd think about it on the ride back. He gathered his horse from the marshal's hitching post, checked the cinch, put his foot in the stirrup. The road north was long, and the light was already starting its afternoon descent. And Cole Bridger, who had walked out of a tree line 3 days ago with no cover and no advantage and no plan except that something was wrong and walking away was worse. Rode toward home. If this story stayed with you, ride with us again. Subscribe and help keep these frontier tales alive for the next firelit night. Because out here, every name has a past, every trail has a cost, and every sunset still remembers. Until next time, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.